All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We've gotten a ton of requests from you all to do a deep dive into the story of Noah's Ark, and
It's a big one.
it is a big one. Yeah, forget that, children's Bible version, right? We're going to really try to unpack the core narrative here,
Yeah,
and see what we find.
absolutely. So we'll be looking at the text itself, going back to Genesis, and then we'll be looking at how it's been interpreted in the three Abrahamic traditions:
Right.
Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And we'll touch on the historical context, especially the Mesopotamian flood myths. And then finally, we'll be taking a look at the theological and the symbolic meaning.
Okay, so jumping right into Genesis, right? The setup is we have a God who is deeply disappointed with humanity.
Yes.
Because of, the pervasive evil that's going on. But then we have Noah, who is described in some translations as righteous and blameless, or in others as perfect, or just like, what's the key takeaway here about Noah's character?
Well, the key takeaway is this radical contrast between Noah and the rest of humanity, because he is described as set apart.
Right.
So amidst the corruption, he is different. He is, blameless. Suggests that he has a moral compass that is radically different than the rest of humanity. And walking with God also suggests a very close relationship.
So this is really someone who stands out. And then we get the instructions for the ark.
Yep.
Right, and it's very specific, right? It's 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, gopher wood. Like, what is gopher wood?
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate about what gopher wood is, but most likely it's a strong, durable wood, like cypress, perhaps.
Okay.
But regardless, the specificity here, the instructions for the compartments, indicate that there was a need for a lot of organization.
Yeah.
For a long journey, the distinction between clean and unclean animals, 7 pairs of clean and 1 pair of unclean animals, also points to some kind of divine order.
Yeah.
That perhaps relates to future sacrificial practices or dietary practices that are going to come into play later on.
Yeah, and then the flood itself, right? I mean, it's just, described as this catastrophe, right? Water from everywhere for 40 days, wiping out pretty much everything. And then there's that one line that says, "And God shut Noah in the ark."
Yes.
That feels significant to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, the sheer scale of the destruction, it emphasizes the severity of God's judgment. But the fact that God shuts him in is this image of protection.
Right.
He's marking Noah and his family as the recipients of grace.
They're chosen. Yeah.
In the midst of this chaos.
And then the waters recede after 150 days, and then we get the story of the raven and the dove. And of course, the dove returns with the olive branch, which is, kind of the classic symbol of hope.
Exactly.
And then after that, Noah makes an offering, and we get a huge promise from God.
Yeah, so the raven, it doesn't find anywhere to land, but the dove comes back with the olive branch, which signifies that the waters are receding and that new life is possible.
Okay.
Noah's response is one of gratitude. He makes an offering, and God promises that he will never again destroy all life with a flood. So that leads us to
The covenant, yeah.
Yeah.
So we get this, God blesses Noah, tells him to be fruitful and multiply, and gives permission to eat meat now, but no blood. And then we also get this idea that, whoever sheds human blood by humans shall their blood be shed, right?
Exactly.
And then we get the rainbow.
Yeah, so this is really the foundational covenant. Allowing the eating of animals is a change,
Right.
but it's this caveat of the blood prohibition, and the value of human life is paramount. Whoever sheds human blood by humans shall their blood be shed. And then you get the rainbow as this visual confirmation of God's promise. And also, I think it functions as a constant reminder, right?
Right.
God's commitment to not destroy the world with a flood.
To Noah, to humanity, yeah. So now let's get into the different ways that this story has been interpreted within the different Abrahamic traditions in Judaism, right? You have this idea of Noah's righteousness being kind of emphasized because it really stands out against the backdrop of a very corrupt world. And the ark itself, it's more than just a boat.
Right. So what's really fascinating is this idea of the ark as a sacred space. And potentially it's linked to the idea of the temple. The same Hebrew word is used for Noah's ark, Moses' basket, and the Ark of the Covenant.
Wow.
So this linguistic link suggests that there's a way of understanding the flood through the lens of the central religious practices that came later on in Jewish history.
And then, so in Christianity, the flood is definitely a story of divine judgment, but it's also, primarily a story of rescue, right? And
Yeah.
the ark becomes this really powerful image that points to Christ.
Precisely. So the ark is seen as the only way to salvation, foreshadowing Christ. The single door, reinforces this idea of one path, right?
Okay.
To salvation.
Okay.
And the covenant and the rainbow are these constant reminders of God's faithfulness. And then you have Noah as this righteous survivor, or what's often called a righteous remnant,
Right.
who survives the judgment.
And then in Islam, Noah is deeply respected as well, referred to as Nu.
Yeah.
And the story of the flood has very similar elements. The ark eventually comes to rest on Mount al-Judi. But there are also some unique interpretations, right?
Yeah. So what's interesting in Islamic thought is that Noah is seen as he's given this title, the first great messenger, and his role as a messenger is really emphasized. And then the ark's construction is divinely guided, of course. But then you get these esoteric interpretations that see the flood as some kind of spiritual cleansing, and the ark can symbolize the prophet's family, or what's called al-bayt, offering this kind of spiritual safety. And then there's even this hadith of the ark that kind of highlights this.
So now for the big question, right? Like, was there an actual global flood? Like, how does this story line up with science and archaeology?
Right. So this is a really crucial question because when we look at it scientifically, the geological evidence, really doesn't support the idea of a global flood as it's described in the text. We see evidence like erosion patterns, salt deposits, the distribution of animals around the world that really, conflicts with the idea of a global flood. Now, of course, there are creationist counter-arguments to this.
Right.
But the scientific consensus is that it doesn't point to a global event.
So no evidence then for finding the ark itself.
Yeah. So despite many claims over the years of finding the Ark on Mount Ararat or in the surrounding regions, nothing verifiable has been found. There have been some interesting formations that have been discovered, like the Durupinar Formation.
Yeah.
But so far, nothing conclusive.
So it's also interesting that this flood story shows up in other cultures, like we see it in ancient Mesopotamia.
Yes.
With stories like Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis myth and other flood myths. So what are the key similarities and differences there?
Yeah, so it's fascinating because these earlier Mesopotamian flood myths share some striking parallels.
Right.
And so that God deciding to send a flood. You have a chosen hero who builds a vessel. He saves animals. Usually sends out birds, and then eventually lands on a mountain. But the differences are also really important because the reasons for the flood are different. The number of gods involved are different. So these connections suggest that there's some kind of shared cultural memory, perhaps, of regional floods.
Right, but the Noah story is unique in its own way.
Precisely.
Yeah, so I guess kind of as we're wrapping up this deep dive, what would you say are the core theological and symbolic messages of this story?
Well, I think ultimately this story explores the themes of divine judgment and mercy. Right? So you have this destruction, but then you have this possibility of redemption, and you have this covenant relationship that's established, and then this idea of the righteous remnant. And I think symbolically the ark symbolizes salvation, the flood waters symbolize judgment and purification, the animals represent all of creation.
Right.
The rainbow symbolizes God's promise, and then the dove is often seen as a symbol of peace, and the raven is more of a symbol of kind of like an unregenerate heart. So it's full of all this rich symbolism.
Yeah, so much richer than we maybe even give it credit for coming in, right?
Yeah.
It's clear that the Noah's Ark story is so much more than a simple children's story. It's a story that has this enduring presence across major world religions and continues to provoke questions and debate about history, meaning, and belief.
And that leads me to a fascinating question for all of you listening out there. Given these diverse interpretations and the echoes we see in other ancient myths, what does the tale of Noah's Ark tell us about humanity's evolving understanding of divine power, justice, and this really persistent hope that we have for a fresh start? So think about that. Think about how the literal story and the profound symbols all kind of work together to give us this rich and enduring narrative.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Noah's Ark story. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.